Hey, what's up again, guys? It's Baker's background with you to kind of round out the 70s as we transition to the 80s. And so we'll get started. You might be wondering, what are all these pictures? Well, think about our last discussion and the one we're going to have today on Carter and how his domestic pardon me, policy is going to be heavily centered around things like energy and recession and trying to basically get America to see that there's light at the end of the tunnel, so to speak. And so all these different pictures that we'll see on this slide and the next slide give us an idea about either domestic things or, in the case of most of our lesson today, the things that we associate with Carter on the side of foreign policy. Okay. And so, we talked last time about the idea of the energy crisis and the gas lines. And I told you all the story about my mom and, her getting home and barely making it after, she was not able to find gas. And guys, literally, when you hear people tell the stories of gas lines and so forth, this is the reality of a lot of this time period, especially the earlier 70s and then also 79-ish. Okay. And so Carter is trying to figure out a way, which is where this next picture is taking us, of kind of consoling the people, giving them, some idea about the way that he's approaching things. And this is what we call his famous crisis of confidence speech. There's a case to be made if you're, a historian out there that, is he kind of telling Americans to suck it up to an extent? Or on the other side of the coin, is it like, we're all in this together? But at the end of the day, we know that there's going to be a lot of things that are popping up. Okay, which brings us to some of the things that's kind of like you argue that there could be some pros and cons with this foreign policy for sure, like any president. And we notice this one on the left here, which we'll talk briefly about. This is, by many historians' account, probably the biggest foreign policy, perhaps success of his time period. And this is the one that dealt with the issue of Middle East relations. Okay, so this is what they call the Camp David Accords, where you've got the Prime Minister of Israel and the Prime Minister of Egypt actually coming together at Camp David, which of course is in Maryland. And Carter had a vision, being somebody that had a really strong biblical background and wanting to try to bring a degree of peace, to get these leaders together and eventually have them sign an accords. And he actually did that, I think it was around 1978. And then the thing that kind of defines his presidency as we transition to Reagan is going to be the infamous hostage crisis, something that, as a lot of you guys know, has had an everlasting effect on American and, of course, Iran diplomatic relations for, of course, over the last 4 decades. Okay. So the question is, okay, we talked about the Middle East to an extent. We talked about, the gas issues. We talked about Iran. And I know all of you are thinking, okay, what about the Cold War here? And where's the Soviet Union? Well, they're still here, right? But just a little bit of background, guys, on the Soviet Union. And this is not the whole story, but the Soviet Union, I think it was in the later 79, November, December, whatever it was, they invaded Afghanistan, right, which became a fairly big war for them. In fact, one or more than one, but historians sometimes label this Afghanistan invasion by the Soviet Union, which did not go as well as they wanted it to, as kind of like almost like a form of their version of Vietnam. Right now, I don't know if that's a stretch or not, but at the end of the day, it does not bode as well for them as they wanted to. They put a lot of resources and a lot of military. You can see the pictures of course, the troops that were a part of the Soviet army. Okay, and the thing that really defines America is what a lot of you guys have heard of, the famous Miracle on Ice. Most of you have heard of that, right? Where you've got this, Russian or Soviet bear with their hockey team winning, every Olympic gold in hockey since, we won it in 60, but they won it in 64, 68, 72, and 76. Nobody gave the United States a chance to win or even really medal. And that's, of course, a picture, guys. And the thing that's interesting with this, I won't share much on this, is that actually there was a lot of political tension over that Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. There was talk about, the Soviets actually not attending the Lake Placid Games, which were the Winter Olympics. If you look at the bottom picture here, you notice that that tension continues into the Summer Games, which were actually held in Moscow in 1980. And a lot of you that are younger might not know the answer to this, but the adults probably do. Should we boycott the Olympic Games? Well, maybe we need to replace the word should with did. And the answer is yes, we did. Okay. So Carter makes it clear his disagreements there, other things as well. And then one of the things that's kind of, I guess, a little bit on the debatable side goes back to this political cartoon about what we call the Panama Canal Treaty. Okay. Now, a lot of you guys, if you remember your earlier history from the earlier 19th or 20th century, you know that the Panama Canal and its construction was pretty much almost like an obsession to then President Theodore Roosevelt. Of course, we know it's a big, big task. It's a big project. A lot of blood, sweat, and tears, literally blood, guys. People died building it. And, almost, what was it, about 70 years after we started building it, 75, we basically are going to commit ourselves in treaty form under Carter to basically give it back to them eventually. All right. And that happens in the late 90s, early 2000s. Not everybody really was on board with that, but eventually that treaty is going to be put forth. Okay. So the question is, what are the two probably biggest events on maybe the positive side, and then, the one that kind of defines him toward the end of his one term? And that's going to be where we look at our objectives. We want to be able to explain how foreign policy events defined his time in office. We've already kind of touched on that. Second thing we want to do is we want to describe how the rise of conservatism in 1970s issues supported a rise of Reagan in 1980. He's the future president that will defeat Carter in 80 and then also go on to serve another term. And then we want to be able, for our next lesson, to be able to kind of have a little bit of context or even understanding of some of the basic principles that define Reagan conservatism. And if you look here, you'll notice I said list instead of explain. And if you're kind of wondering, well, what's the good of listing? Listing means we can identify. The explanation, glad you all asked about that, is actually going to be where we pick up next time. So let's get started further. So Carter has given a lot of very good attention, and he even talks about this in many of his interviews and things like that. He did win later on the Nobel Peace Prize, by the way, which is a pretty big award, as we know. But his big focus was humanitarian issues, right? He didn't agree with some of the previous administrations with how they carried out wars and policies and all these different things. And that's not just him picking on Nixon, although part of it was him certainly directing some attention the way that Nixon carried things out. But humanitarian ideals, or shall we say, focus is going to be a really big piece of that. This actually plays into some of the concerns that he had with Middle Eastern kinds of conflicts, right? If you go back and you look at the Arab-Israeli conflict, which, you could say, well, what about that kind of getting established further after World War II? Certainly, guys, you could look at like the establishment of Israel formally after World War II, the way we think about it in modern days. But there's no question that there's been conflict in that region for a long time. Okay, so Carter kind of sees it as his almost like a humanitarian vision or even a goal. And the story is that he invites both of these leaders that you saw in the previous slide over, Mikhail Begin and also Anwar al-Sadat. Sadat was the Egyptian prime minister. Begin was the Israeli. Now, the thing to keep in mind, guys, as you can imagine, Carter actually tells this story well in some of the videos you might watch outside of this one, is basically all they wanted to do was argue about what he called ancient grievances. Okay. And so there's a story that one historian told where these two guys are arguing, they can't agree, and it gets to a point where They're both about ready just to storm out, right? So they're so angry. And Carter basically almost like puts his foot in the door and says, no, we are going to iron out this peace accords. And it worked, at least in principle. Okay. And so you might be wondering, well, why is this a big deal? Well, Egypt is formally entered a peace agreement with, of course, the non-Arab state of Israel, which is a huge breakthrough. And you could argue that in the earlier 80s, Sadat, down the line, 4 years later, I believe it was, is going to be shot and killed, right? And so you notice like some, even in the 90s, when you have a additional emphasis on this, Yitzhak Rabin, who was the then prime minister of Israel, will also be assassinated as well. And so sometimes, guys, unfortunately, not everybody sees peace the same way, right? Was Carter being ideological? Was he being realistic? That's for you all to kind of maybe land your plane on. But this is considered to be, by some people's standards, almost like his foreign policy trophy, right? A lot like that SALT I treaty of Nixon. Okay, what does not go as well is eventually going to be what defines the tail end of his presidency, literally until the time that Reagan is making, believe it or not, his inaugural address. Right, and I'll talk about that in a moment. But you have this big, overthrow that we call the Iranian Revolution. You had, if you go back to the 1950s, you have this coup d'etat or covert operation by the CIA, where they basically overthrew the Iranian leadership, and they put Reza Shah Pahlavi in power. That's his picture with the cursor. As you can see there, he looks very different than from the guy that's on the left-hand side here, Ayatollah Khomeini. He's more pro-Western. He's still Muslim, like many Arabs are. But what do you notice? He's not going to be as popular with a lot of the Iranian people moving, of course, long term. But American government did have some favor for him. And what happens, we had an embassy up until this famous hostage crisis. And so you see this overthrow eventually of the American embassy. And some of the people, most of them made it out, some did not. There's different documentaries and even pop culture films about that. But eventually, guys, what happens is that a more, some people would call it fundamentalist Islam, the people that really believe, in that concept, were basically able to be led by Ayatollah Khomeini and other leaders. They overthrew the American embassy, the government. And basically what has happened since, as a lot of you guys, I think, know, our relations, I think it's safe to say, at best, have been rocky and many times very, very volatile. Okay. And so what do we notice that Carter is trying to figure out? What is the best way to go about trying to be able to get the hostages out, over 50 hostages, without them being basically killed or whatever. And so Carter tells the story, keep in mind he's alive to talk about these things, where somebody, a historian or somebody of the press once asked him, they said, well, what were you trying to do? Because there was a failed attempt to try to get the hostages out, and he takes some heat for that. And I really appreciate what Carter said. He said, my main goal was to get every hostage out of there safe and also free. Definitely an admirable goal, given a guy that again cared about humanitarian causes. So the question is, when he's up for re-election in 1980, and I'll end with this last couple of things. As you can imagine, energy crisis issues, gas lines, shortages, and then of course recession, and then you throw on top of it the Iranian hostage crisis. And what do we notice about his approval rating? His approval rating has gone down quite a bit. Okay. Americans are starting to look again at a different face of the country, so to speak, as some people would say. And another thing, guys, to keep in mind, a lot of people, when they think of Reagan, there is something to be said about Reagan conservatism and, him, keeping principles, but also doing some things that are a little bit different in office. The saying is politics is politics. He does work well with Congress talking about Reagan. But the one thing to also keep in mind is that at least a strong faction of Americans are trying to get beyond some of the stigmas of some of the liberal tendencies of the 60s and 70s. In other words, conservatism is going to pop up once again, and Reagan is going to basically have a base of Republicans that support him, and then also other conservatives and even Democrats like my grandmother. My grandmother was a lifelong, what you might would call a New Deal Democrat, even a Kennedy Democrat. Okay, but for whatever reason, in 80 and also 84, which was the last election she voted in, there was some appeal about Reagan that basically made her vote as a Democratic bloc most of her life as a Reagan Democrat. Okay. And so you're going to have a faction. Now, certainly not all Democrats are going to be Reagan Democrats. My mom, who was on the other side of Democrats, did not vote for Reagan in 80 or 84, but there's going to be at least a faction of Democrats that support Reagan. They like his approach, his leadership style, whatever. Of course, your traditional Republicans, and then one group that really is going to support Reagan and a lot of his things that we'll talk about next time is going to be a group called the New Right Coalition. A lot of people associate this with the moral majority, which was basically set up or at least led by a gentleman at the time by the name of Reverend Jerry Falwell. For those of you that have actually heard of the university called Liberty, then you probably know a little bit about him. Very, very outspoken about supporting this reemergence, if you will, of conservatism. And it does, of course, work. Okay. Reagan's inaugural, we'll analyze a little bit in our next session and talk about it. But the question, guys, for you to maybe even pause on the next slide for a minute to kind of think about is basically what are some of the things that drive Reagan conservatism and some of the things that he stood for, these principles. And this is basically what we're getting at. So take a moment to look at it, and then we'll unpack it just for a few moments before we transition to what we'll do next week. Okay, U.S. history students, did you have time to look, to at least ponder? Now, your objective here says to list. So we're not going to go into a lot of detail about this today, but we'll come back to it. But what I want you to think about for our next time and next session is why do all these things basically, what do you think they mean in regards to how Reagan's going to lead the nation over the next 8 years? What does he mean when he says returning to founders wisdom, limited government? He has a lot to say about that, especially in inaugural and other speeches. And then, guys, the big thing that we'll spend some time on in our next session is definitely going to be, again, his foreign policy, right? And we're going to focus more so on things like, how does he basically engage the Soviet Union? This, as the press love to, my students know I love Star Wars, so I have to throw in this evil empire idea that the Soviets were basically still kind of like that kid on the other side of the block that we just can't get along with. How is a Reagan going to address that? Okay. And those are things for you to at least think about for next week. Okay. Shout out to your parents and your grandparents and people that that are older. Guys, I'm going to encourage you to ask them about these time periods and to maybe even give us some perspective on what they told you. Okay. But anyway, I'm out. This has been Baker's Backyard. Hope you all have a great rest of your week, and feel free to let me know if you have any questions. Otherwise, take care, and I'll see you next time in the next episode of Baker's Backyard. See you later. Thanks.